Hello again everyone. Today we're going to talk about a few different feminist theories and how you can apply them when you're studying literature. It's necessarily difficult to simply define what a feminist is, because there are so many different types of feminism. There are so many areas of life in which equality for women is something being fought for. So in the same way, it would be reductive and oversimplistic to suggest that there's only one type of feminist theory when you're looking at literature, or only one way to approach a text as a feminist. Today we're going to look at three specific forms of feminist theory in a bit more detail, so that when you adopt a feminist lens in your essays, you can be more specific and therefore construct more meaningful analyses and evaluations of the texts that you're studying. Let's start with one that you already know a little bit about, Laura Mulvey's male gaze theory. So, in her 1975 article, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, Laura Mulvey described a phenomenon known as the male gaze. Her argument uses ideas from Freud's psychoanalysis, ideas such as scopophilia, meaning the pleasure that one might get from looking at another person as an erotic object, physical attraction. In itself, that's not an oppressive act, but Mulvey was concerned with the process of objectification that took place as part of this, especially when men look at women, or when they produce works of art that look at women as sexual objects. Now, our culture is saturated, absolutely full of the male gaze. Pornography is the obvious example of an art form created to empower, more often than not, the male viewer, and to reduce the humanity of the, more often than not, female subject being observed. But that's the extreme example in which the male gaze is obvious. The gaze is just as active in other works of literature, visual art, film, television, often in a subtler and therefore more insidious, more sort of creeping way. Take Buffy the Vampire Slayer, for example. Now, Buffy is a powerful female lead. She goes around killing supernatural villains and protecting the lives of her friends, often having to save the feckless boys her high school seems to be full of. So why does she need to do all of this stuff in figure-hugging tops and short skirts? It probably doesn't make fighting vampires easier. This is because, especially in the first series of the programme, she is presented for the visual pleasure of the male viewer. This is the effect of the male gaze. Our second theory for the day, Judith Butler's gender performativity. Now, according to Butler's theory of gender performativity, the important aspects of gender aren't natural, they're not inherent to us. All the things that we regularly use to distinguish between male and female are learned. They're things that we learn to do and perform. As a child, you might have been encouraged to play with an action man if you were a boy, or a Barbie if you were a girl. Before you were even born, family and friends might have bought you pink clothes as a present, knowing that you were going to be born female, whatever that means. By repeating actions associated with being male, you practiced and performed what it is to be male. Now, Butler argues that this is very powerful social conditioning, and it's often done without conscious thought. We are taught from birth the actions appropriate, or deemed appropriate, for men and women. Now, this maintains and legitimizes, so sort of makes acceptable, what seems like a natural gender binary, when in fact it's entirely cultural. There's nothing natural about it at all. For example, think about Wolf Alice in the Bloody Chamber collection. She's raised as a wolf, and through the course of the story, learns to behave more like a human female. But Carter suggests that there's something inherently wolf-like in her nature till the end, no matter how much she performs the role of a human female. Carter was posing a question in this story that Butler almost seems to have sort of picked up again in the 1990s when she wrote her most famous works. If we weren't taught to perform gender so thoroughly in the way that we are, according to Judith Butler, from early childhood, if we weren't taught to be like that, what aspects of our gender identities would be left? Which bits are naturally there? Which leads us to our third theory for the day, cultural feminism. The term cultural feminism was actually originally intended as a bit of an insult in feminist circles of the 1970s. Cultural feminists were accused of promoting the biological differences between men and women as a reason to assign different roles to them. It's a form of biological essentialism, saying people are essentially different if they're different genders. So some cultural feminists desired the separation of women-only, women-run centres and spaces to challenge negative gendered constructions. So they wanted female spaces that were separate. And Angela Carter engaged with ideas like this, most prominently, not in fact in The Bloody Chamber, but in her novel The Passion of New Eve, which was published 2 years earlier than the fairy tales in 1977. So it's pretty good context to give us a sense of what Carter is thinking when, in 1979, she comes to write The Bloody Chamber. In the novel, she imagined a community of women formed around a sort of supernatural figure known as Mother, deep in the Californian desert. And her depiction of this community is as much a criticism of cultural feminism's failure to engage with and take on the patriarchy as it was a strong depiction of female power. So I'm not saying that Angela Carter was a cultural feminist. In fact, almost the opposite. She was arguing against that separation, saying, well, women and particularly feminist groups should be a part of the system so that they can disrupt its patriarchal underpinning. Now, obviously, there are many different types of feminist literary theory that we've not covered in this video, and which are equally worth exploring for your coursework and indeed more broadly for your general edification. Use these three that I've given you today as a starting point to then go off and explore the other types of feminist theory that are out there. For now, you're going to choose one of these types of feminism to apply to an analysis of your second coursework text. You're going to write a mini essay answering this question: how does the author of your second coursework text present women? Use one of the following feminist theories to examine the writer's choices: the male gaze, gender performativity, or cultural feminism. This should give you a chance to explore each one in more detail and in application to a text that you should now know pretty well.